Welcome back to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, excited to join Wayne Stender here for another episode of our Further Upstream conversations. My recent conversation with Matthew Sleeth was, I think, the third time I've had him on the podcast. So we've talked about trees, we've talked about mental health and hope in the midst of a culture of suicide. And now we've kind of revisited that second topic because May is National Mental Health Awareness Month. And it's something that I wasn't really aware of until more recently in my life. It's something that I think the church needs to discuss very frankly and seriously so that we can understand what's going on here from a non-materialist perspective, but one that still respects a lot of the insights that we have gained, that science and medicine have gained in recent years about these problems that beset us that are getting worse every day. So Wayne, thanks for joining me. I hope we can really have a good conversation on this and not be too dark and depressing, because after all, Dr. Sleeth is all about hope, and he thinks it's part of the cure for this terrible affliction in our society.
Yeah. I will tell you, coming out of winter in Minnesota and seeing May is like, I don't know if you've seen videos of calves coming out of the barn in the springtime, and they just they're kicking and they're dancing and that's like literally you can see that on the faces of people, or actually in the bodies of people here in my town. It's like today, it's a beautiful day. It's 70 degrees. It's sunny. We are kicking like little calves here. And so when we talked about this episode and May being Mental Health Awareness Month, I thought, well, obviously, because in Minnesota, we're coming out of it's like literally coming out of Narnia, and the joy of the Pevensey, not necessarily the Pevensey children maybe, but like the animals inside of Narnia that get so excited at this. Whoa, that's what I feel like right now. So
after it's been winter for 100 years.
Oh yeah. Yeah. You have no idea. It's like winter 8 months out of the year here, and we get 1 month of happiness, and we're like, I could go for another round of winter. That's what we do up here. We're a little bit crazy, but
you live where the air hurts your face. Have you ever seen that meme? It's like, why do I live where the air hurts my face? And then it shows a picture of a giant spider down in more tropical climes, and a giant snake, and like an alligator leaning against someone's door here in Florida. And you go, oh, that's why I live where the air hurts my face.
Yeah. You're in the sunshine state. You're perpetually happy. You've got all those animals that like to eat you. Like, do your thing, man. There's nothing up here that's going to eat me. So it's a good place to live. But we're coming into this place of kind of this idea of sadness. That's something that you talked about with Dr. Sleeth, looking a little bit at suicide rates, but then also Dr. Sleeth talked about how a lot of the technologies have enabled us to not only identify people that are attempting suicide or living through suicide, but also, I would say, probably addressing or identifying people that are just sad. Like there's just a reality of sadness kind of, I think, in general culture. And we're seeing that there's a lot of articles that have been written recently. We've done a number of breakpoints on that. So one of the things that you guys talked about was the interplay of the spiritual and the physical. And I thought it was really interesting because you were really sensitive to the fact that sometimes as Christians, we can over spiritualize things and make this really about an issue inside of spirituality. And I thought it was really an interesting conversation. Give me a perspective on why you kind of leaned into that a little bit.
So that's a very important question, Wayne, and I'm glad we started with it. If you have ever walked with someone through a mental health issue, and you have done that in a Christian context in the church, I think you'll know what I'm talking about when I speak of the over-spiritualization of the whole question. When someone is confronted with an issue of the balance of neurotransmitters in their brain, and we know it's that because it responds to treatment that corrects the imbalance, and that's a significant part or the whole of what's going on with them, there will be well-meaning Christians who will respond along the lines of, saying that, well, you just need to get your spiritual life in order. You just need to find your hope in Jesus. You just need to believe the gospel harder. You just need to have more faith, and God will either heal you or it'll fix your problem because you're sad, right? And Christians shouldn't be sad. You should stop being sad and have hope in the Lord. And that response, I think, fails to recognize the fact that we are not just spiritual beings, that we are also physical beings. And that just as the heart or the liver or the lungs or the intestines or any other part of the body can have an ailment that causes it to break down and prevents its normal functioning, the same is true of the brain. And we know that, though we don't believe the person as such lives in the brain, that a person can continue to exist without the brain, we do know that the brain is intimately involved in what it means to express your personhood. I like C.S. Lewis's metaphor of the brain as a wireless, or what, British people in his day called a radio. So, he says the radio is how you hear the announcements and the music and the news and all of that. It is not those things in and of itself. Nevertheless, it's a kind of transmitter, and it has to be in good working order. It has to have full power. All its components have to be in good shape in order to receive all of that and for communication to take place. And I think something very similar is the case with the brain. That means that we have to be very careful as Christians not to see an issue with personality or with mental health or behavior and automatically conclude that it is solely a spiritual issue, or that it's even primarily a spiritual issue. And this is something that I think is rooted in the New Testament itself. If you read through the Gospels, and this has been observed by a number of writers, I think Matthew Sleeth does as well. If you read through the Gospels, there's a fairly distinct differentiation in Jesus' miracles between the moments where he is casting out a demon, and ridding someone of spiritual oppression, and where he is actually fixing some kind of congenital or physical issue. And it's not only external stuff like healing a withered hand or fixing eyes. It's also things like fixing someone who's mute, or a child who has epilepsy, sort of seizures take place and so forth. There are instances where that's attributed to demonic activity, and there's instances where it's not. And I think that we can look at the picture of mental health and health more broadly and draw some similar conclusions. We need to be very open as Christians to there being physical issues that need to be corrected, and not rush to the conclusion that, it's purely a spiritual problem. And the reason I emphasize that is because I think it's the more likely experience of Christians, and particularly conservative, spiritually conscious, supernaturalist circles, that rightly recognize that human beings are not just bundles of molecules that can be treated with chemicals. We also need to be treated as spiritual beings, because that's also what we are. And the world fails to recognize that. It thinks medication is the answer to everything. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes people really do have demonic oppression. Sometimes people really do have a deep-seated spiritual issue that's breaking their body. And we need to be sensitive and open to that. Places Christians in a uniquely challenging and paradoxical place, but I think it's one that recognizes the whole of what the human being is. Nevertheless, my experience has been fairly strong on the one side and not the other. And so I caution against that. And I think Dr. Sleeth is of the same mindset.
Yeah. He talked a little bit about John Wesley and some realities of the church that Wesley was working in, where any physical ailments were really seen as a lack of faith. And I thought that was really an interesting idea. I got the sense that Dr. Sleeth was calling the church to an attention. And I think that even in your discussion, you were calling the church to an attention. And I got the sense that Wesley was calling the church to remember that there is a fall. There is a fall that actually kind of impacts humans. But right now, you guys talked a little bit about Philip Reef, and I'd like you to kind of go into that in a little bit here. But I want you to speak to this topic, or this idea that maybe in terms of kind of the 4-chapter story of the gospel, for Wesley, the church had maybe kind of forgotten that the fall impacts all of humanity. But right now, we're in a very therapeutic kind of time in history where, therapy and how we feel is kind of highlighted. And I wonder is there a part of even that 4-chapter story of the gospel that we're missing on, that might not necessarily be what the fall looks like? We might identify that there is a mental health crisis. And I think kind of around, even inside of the church, we identify that. But are we missing the creation story? Are we missing the redemption or the restoration part of this? Where do you think we've kind of maybe come unmoored or unattached to God's grand story? And we've tried to now, like we're Abraham and we're like, hey, God, I understand that you've got a plan for me, but there might be a better way for this to happen. Do you think that we're stepping into God's story and trying to rewrite what redemption looks like or what restoration looks like, or even maybe in the biological sense of what creation looks like? I think of people like that are battling with gender dysphoria, that we say that gender identity is something for you to decide, and really that's not something that we find in scripture. God calls Adam man, and God calls Eve woman. He doesn't give them the opportunity to call themselves that. So where do you think we're missing it? And maybe we're missing it on all 4 chapters of the story right now. But is there a way that you feel like maybe we're missing the whole understanding of the story? We've become unmoored from God's story.
Dr. Sleeth referred in his book to ours as an unlivable society. So a whole set of circumstances have come together, and practices and ways of life and ways of living and ways of housing ourselves and ways of having relationships and ways of conceiving of ourselves and of relating to the spiritual and relating to technology, and all of these factors have come together to form a mix that is just antithetical to human well-being. It makes it really difficult to be happy and whole. It makes it very, very easy to fall apart and break yourself and become a shadow of a human being. And so we have to recognize that set of circumstances and not just say, oh, we can fix it all with medication, right? Earlier today, I talked with John, and we recorded our most recent Q&A, and we talked a little bit about the mental health of boys in particular in relation to biblical manhood and womanhood. And we mentioned the possibility that has been floated by quite a few, that we have created a particularly unlivable society for boys, that we have pathologized part of what's actually the nature of young males. And that's why we have these astronomical, unreasonable numbers of students in like elementary and middle school on Ritalin and other ADHD medications. How high of a percentage of boys do you have to have medicated before you begin to question your diagnoses and maybe wonder whether you're pathologizing male nature? That's not to deny that there are mental illnesses that need those treatments, and that one in particular. It is to say that we need to be careful not to confuse a correct diagnosis with a correct explanation for the problem. So diagnosis can recognize something that's wrong. It doesn't necessarily tell you what caused it, whether that's a congenital issue or a nurture. Is it nature or nurture? And when I asked Dr. Sleeth about schizophrenia in particular, that was a revealing moment, because he claims that schizophrenia has remained relatively constant across time and throughout cultures. And obviously there's some retroactive diagnosis going on there, historical issues people didn't understand. But it looks like schizophrenia is, rooted, as best I understand it, to a large extent in a congenital issue. It's like it's part of your genetic makeup, the vulnerability to that. And so a certain number of people will always be experiencing that. It's not the case for the rise in suicide. It's not the case for the rise in depression. I think there's probably congenital depression, but I know there's also circumstance-induced depression. There is depression that comes about as a result of an unlivable society, as he says. And that is what we need to really be careful to look at and not say, oh, we're going to redeem ourselves chemically and medically from our problems, instead of allowing God's story and God's plan for redemption to correct the way we live and to address our depression and despair that way. Like, is it really a good thing in our society that we have virtually unlimited availability to the most powerful narcotics in the history of the world? Right? Is it a good thing in our society that the number of close friends people report having is at an all-time low? Is it a good thing in our society that intact families, multi-generational marriage after marriage and family after family is basically the exception instead of the rule? Is that healthy? Is that okay? Is that livable? Is engaging primarily with other people over screens, is that livable? And enough of these questions accumulate, I think you begin to get to the point where you're saying, oh yeah, if we respond to this by just slapping chemicals onto it, just giving people pills and so forth, and doing nothing else and asking no harder questions, then we are like Abraham taking, Hagar, to fulfill the plan that we think God has for us in our way, instead of in the way that He's promised to fulfill it. And that goes back to the original question we asked about not treating people as mere bags of chemicals, but as embodied spirits, as beings with both a material and an immaterial side, and not falling into the trap our culture wants us to fall into. The reason I brought up Philip Reeve was because he wrote a book called The Triumph of the Secular, which Carl Trueman draws heavily on for his recent books, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self and Strange New World. And he draws on Philip Reeve as a key moment in Western thinking where we began to psychologize and therapeuticize everything, if I can make that a word. We viewed everything through a therapeutic lens. So now people don't have sin, they have pathologies. They don't have, brokenness, they have trauma. They don't need a pastor, they need a therapist. And that's not to deny that any of those things are valid in their own sphere, but it is to deny that we can understand all problems in a therapeutic way. And the problem is that, according to Trueman, the therapeutic has become this hammer, right? And every problem now looks like a nail that we can address with therapy and medication and so forth. And that's just not the case with human beings. And so Christians have this special opportunity to speak into the confusion around the rising tide of mental illness, a tide, by the way, which is rising even in the midst of, historically high prosperity, economic and material well-being.
Even before COVID.
Yeah, right. Record low, like infant mortality, the highest levels of universal education, like lowest levels of teen pregnancy that we've seen since, I think, the 60s. These sorts of things, these metrics, as the New York Times pointed out recently, look fairly good. And yet kids are despairing and trying to kill themselves. So what is it that made this society unlivable? Can we answer that question instead of just trying to continually pump out more medication? I think we can and we must. And that's part of Dr. Sleeth's argument.
Yeah. I just read Nietzsche's The Madman, where he talks about God kind of being dead and we've killed him. And this madman kind of jumps into the midst of this crowd that has killed God and kind of says, what are you going to do now? You've wiped the earth. You've wiped the sky of the stars.
You unchained us from the sun.
Yeah, you've unchained us from the sun, and then he goes into this idea of like, what water is there to clean yourself? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games are you going to invent now? The greatness of this deed is too great for you, and he kind of talks about this. And then he ends the poem in this really haunting way of like, oh, I've come too early. The madman says, there's tremendous event is still on its way. It's still wandering. It's still yet to reach the ears of men. And James Sire has an interesting comment on this from a book that he wrote in 2004, where he talks about, he says this near future is really a cultural anarchy, and it's really inevitable that we've really wiped God away. And so I've always wondered, like, when will that time be that we will arrive at this place now that the madman's talking about, where we start to deal with or wrestle with the weight of we've now wiped God away. And now we're trying to, like you said, find pathologies or different scientific engagements to help us deal with really a brokenness that we were never designed to bear. We see that inside the Old Testament, that we have these festivals and these rituals to atone for our sins, but it does not cover the weight of that sin apart from the blood of Christ. So are we at that place now, do you think, in history where the weight of kind of Nietzsche's madman is kind of weighing down on us? Is this moment in history where we have this rise in sadness and depression? Is this that time? Or was it as true in the 1800s, what Nietzsche was writing about, as it is today? What are your thoughts there? Do we bear more weight in this moment than they did in the 1800s?
Well, one of the main factors I didn't mention a second ago that Dr. Sleeth brings out in Hope Always is the decline of religious faith. That's the unchaining that the madman talked about. That's the death of God and the fact that we now have to become gods and decide our own values and meaning. And shape of the world in order to be counted worthy of so great a deed, is what he says, but really so terrible a deed as the expulsion of God from our lives. And yes, I think that we are in a place where that has progressed further than it was in Nietzsche's time. You could look at the statistics about religious participation. It's quite low historically in this country. It's bottomed out completely in places like Europe. So America is actually fairly religious by Western standards still. Much of the rest of the Western world is just completely atheistic and secular, and they barely remember the days when they were religious. So that plays into it. Dr. Sleeth also pointed to the fact that, and these were helpful statistics, and you can look at back at them in the book, but he points to the fact that, religious people, people with a committed faith where they participate on a regular basis in corporate worship and so forth, have predictably longer and happier lives. It's an interesting metric, and I don't know how far across different faiths that goes. I would venture to guess that it's probably fairly universal, no matter what your religious persuasion is, which tells me that it's not so much the individual doctrines that actually confer the benefit, but it's just the fact that you're worshiping and that there's something outside of you that you hold more valuable and significant than yourself. It tells me that a basic human need is to see yourself as participating in a greater story and in service to a greater reality, an intelligence, a love, a being, whatever, than just your own self-expressive individual self. That's a very destructive way to live. And I think if you control for like economic factors and stuff, it's unambiguously a more destructive way to live. And so the majority of people now are thrust into this place where, even as Truman points out, even religion itself, right? The cure for this, the supposed cure for this, has become just another expressive choice. So even the most historic religions, even the ones that are the most communal and the least in cahoots with expressive individualism. Let's take Roman Catholicism, for example. Okay. This was something that you just were in times past, right? You were born in France. Guess what, kid? You're Catholic. That's how it worked. Now, being Roman Catholic in the modern West is just another consumer choice. It's just another expressive choice you make. And I'm not trying to pick on Catholics. Same thing is true of Presbyterians.
And Lutherans. We'll just throw that in there.
And Lutherans, right? It's just something that you're like, I could drive to any church I want. I could be a Scientologist if I want. I could drive over to St. Petersburg and join the Scientologists. But instead, I'm going to the Presbyterian church down the street. Why? Well, I would give you a list of doctrinal convictions that have led me to that point. But ultimately, you have to say that there is a kind of mechanical fact of choice that I've done there, that it was not put on me. It's not part of my environment in which I asked to inhabit and live. It's choice. And I think it's a good choice, but it's a choice still. And the same thing is true of all religions, which means that even religion itself is now vulnerable to becoming a part of that big, expressive, God is dead, we're making our own truth soup that we find ourselves swimming in. And Truman admits just that. He says, look, we're all kind of expressive individualists now. There's not really anything we can do to rewind the clock and get back to a time when life was more given than it is now. And you know what? That's okay. God put us in this moment. He understands. He's not caught off guard by this. And he still wants us to try to live in accord with eternal truths. And one of those eternal truths is that worshiping and honoring a reality higher and outside of yourself is beneficial for you. Now, that's obviously not the basis on which we decide what's true. And that's certainly not the basis on which we decide, which religion is right. We decide that on the basis of investigating which one is right. As Lewis said, don't just ask what's beneficial or what's cool or what's modern or what's progressive or what's any of these adjectives. Ask what's true. And so we do that. But it just so happens that being something other than a self-absorbed, self-expressive individualist among other individualists is good for you. And it gives you a great deal of hope. And it's not just because you're worshiping something, but it's also because you're with other people in community and you have a sense of belonging. And that's what so many people are missing today. And I think Dr. Sleeth would agree. a great deal of what's wrong and a great deal of what's driving so many people statistically to despair and suicide is the fact that they have nothing mooring them down and nothing making greater sense of their life beyond their own choices. And they hate that. They want something. They need something to make greater sense of the world. So that's my understanding of that. I hope it kind of makes sense.
Yeah. So I wanted to go into that a little bit because I get the impression that you're really talking about the importance and value of church. And Dr. Sleeth talked about that when he talks about the need for Sabbath and rest and things of that nature. But I've wrestled with this a little bit, and partly because, and I might get in trouble for mentioning this, but my church is building a brand new sanctuary, and it's a significant undertaking, and it's beautiful and it's amazing and all these great things, right? But I grew up in really a Lutheran church that, you know, when you turn the church upside down, I would do this as a little kid. I would imagine the church being turned upside down because our pastor would talk about the design and, you know, the ark and how it draws our eyes upward, and we see the cross, and there's like different things of icon that kind of not just are there for us to think, oh, isn't that pretty, but also it's a reminder for us as we go into worship that this is something that is significant. It's something that people have a testimony for. But oftentimes, I think when we look at church, we really look at it almost through that therapeutic lens, like you're talking about with Dr. Truman, where, you know, church is about kind of making me feel good or happy, or we, you know, we look at it through the four relationships, and it's almost like, I don't know if you're a part of a social club in Florida. In Minnesota, we have these like Kiwanis Club and these cool things. And we get together, we eat lunch, and then we sing these songs. I don't know why we sing songs, but they bring out like the Grand Old Flag, and we'll sing this song in this community group. And then sometimes we'll sing like a hymn, maybe once in a while around Christmas. But I look around and I think, man, this is like church. Like, we're gathering for the betterment of other people. The only thing that's not like church is we're in this really stale room and it smells of like elderberry or whatever. Not elderberry, but that's from a different movie.
That's from Monty Python. Yeah. Your father was a hamster and your mother smelt of elderberry. I forget which, is it father or mother? I forget which one it is, but yeah, right. That's the French insult.
Obviously has a descendant in Minnesota. That's why they thought of that. But the room's just kind of stale. It's kind of low ceilings. It's poorly lit. But we sing these hymns. We're there for social gathering. But I look at that through the lens of like, what is God's relational structure? And there's a four relational structure, right? It's upward, it's to each other, it's inward, it's also to the earth. So help me unpack that a little bit and turn this conversation a little bit to something bright or hopeful. What is it about the church that really gives us that sense of hope? Why does Dr. Sleeth really think, and maybe kind of through your eyes, I don't want you to channel Dr. Sleeth here. That would be totally not Christian for you to do, but
especially since he's not dead.
Yeah, I know, right? That'd be really awkward. We could just call him up. That'd be a lot easier. But for you, why is it that church gives hope? What is it, this significance about that gives us hope? And it's not just a social club that we gather with.
Yeah, that's a really good and big question. There's one element of it, I think, that does apply to all or most religions. And that is just the pure, vague sense that you are a part of something bigger and more important than just yourself. I think that you will probably you'll be able to juice that benefit out of Islam or Buddhism just as well as Christianity. That sense of belonging is big, and people do get that from all kinds of spiritual beliefs that we may look at and consider false. But beyond that, I would make the case for Christianity as something that is uniquely beneficial in that way. So it's not just true, it's good for you, and it is good. You know, God is good as well as the truth, and is beautiful as well. And the Christian story is one with unique beauties that no other faith can rival. And I think that's why the Christian story has led to more compassion, more concern for the weak and downtrodden, for the broken, and a picture of the least being greatest and the last being first that no other faith ever has. And you can read someone like Tom Holland to get the recognition of that, or Rodney Stark, to see that part of the reason we care about people who are depressed and want to kill themselves is because we come out of a Christian background. And Jesus cared about people like that. And Jesus didn't abandon the least and the lost. And that's why we We care. Even secular people still have that Christian sensibility operating at the back of their minds. And that's why they behave the way they do. So Christianity teaches that. And it does so because of that very important recognition that this is not the way the world is supposed to be. Something's wrong. And just by recognizing that something's wrong, Christianity awakens and validates a deep part of us that rebels and revolts against this world in its current state. We look at things and say, this is wrong. Children shouldn't be suicidal. People shouldn't have to stay in, mental institutions to recover. No one should be so alone and lacking for a sense of purpose in their life that they wonder whether it even makes sense to go on living. These are things that are wrong with the world. And if you feel that way too, guess what? You're right. And there is a God who cares and a God who wants to set all things to rights again and fix all these problems and make all the sad things come untrue. And that's the essence of the gospel. It's cosmic in scope. It redeems all that's wrong in creation, all that's broken and futile as a result of human sin. And that alone is a recognition that I know has given me just immense hope. And I don't know how I would ever confront the world as it is as a secularist if I had to say, well, this is just the way it is, and there's nothing wrong with it. It is just the way it is. And my revulsion to it and my reaction against the way things are is just a foolish, wishful, self-serving desire that has no real claim on reality. But Christianity says, well, the reason you are upset at the world the way it is because you, in your heart, remember and recognize a world that wasn't like this. And you long for it to be, again, that world, to be redeemed, restored, glorified. And Christianity promises exactly that. And then the last thing that Christianity does uniquely, I think, among all the faiths of the world, is it embodies the recognition of human suffering and the wrongness of the world in a single person. So God himself, rather than being aloof and sort of the providential inflictor or supervisor of all of this misery, is the one who steps into history and takes the worst of it upon himself and actually experiences it. And it's telling that Matthew, when he quotes Isaiah 53 for, I think, the first time, where he says, just as it was written, he has taken up our, afflictions and borne our infirmities, or something along those lines. He translates the Hebrew in Isaiah in a way that applies to sicknesses. Jesus is healing sicknesses early in his ministry. And he actually applies Isaiah 53, which we typically just apply to this crucifixion, to that. He applies it to Jesus taking up our infirmities and healing our sicknesses. That's a beautiful recognition because he's experiencing them in himself. He's welcoming those people to him and he's healing them of their infirmities. And I forget who it was that wrote this, but I really appreciated it and it stuck with me. Well, it was N.T. Wright. Now I remember. It was N.T. Wright. Jesus' miracles were not just magic tricks to show off his power and convince people to follow him. They were announcements of a coming world in which all these things will be undone. So they're like a foretaste or a guarantee. It's a business card or calling card or a badge that Jesus showed people that said, look, I am the resurrector. I am the restorer. I'm the one who comes and fixes it all. And you like this, you haven't tasted anything yet. Just wait till you see the whole resurrection and glorification that's to come. And that's what he tells Martha at Lazarus' tomb. So seeing all that embodied in one person, that restoration process, and then his joining us in our suffering and actually experiencing it himself, together with the general benefits of believing in something higher than yourself, recognizing something's wrong with this world. Those three things together, I think, make a case for Christianity being the best response to despair, mental anguish, and what's broken in our time, and to the spiritual drift and nihilism that results from, Nietzsche's observation. And it wasn't so much a declaration as an observation. He was just like, look, this is where we are in history, and I'm a prophet, and I can see where we are, but you guys haven't figured it out yet. You're still so ensconced in your early, like, modern era optimism and sort of Victorian hubris that you can't see yet where we're going. And it's funny because you do see that, it's like there's this latent Protestant sensibility that just sort of holds on to much of the West, especially in England, where they've explained God away. Darwin has explained how human beings came to be. There's no need for religion anymore, but hey, we can still be civilized and decent and charitable chaps, right? We can still behave well. And then, of course, very quickly, demagogues and tyrants come along and they're like, well, what do you mean? What is good? What is right? What is being a good chap? English manners are only going to, Protestant sensibilities are only going to survive for so long. And now here we are in a world bereft of purpose, where it tells us this is how things just really are and doesn't give us anyone to take up our infirmities. And it's left people ultimately in a very dark place. And I'm not saying that's the whole reason we are where we are, and that's the whole reason for the suicide statistics. But I agree with Matthew Sleeth that it is a main reason, and it's probably at the source of a lot of the other things that we point to and say those are causes.
Mm-hmm. You keep dragging us down into these really dark holes. I just thought I should make that known right now, that I'm trying to be optimistic and hopeful, and you keep going down these good.
I just gave you the resurrection and the life, man.
Yeah, you did. And then you ended with but this is why we're all depressed. I understand where you're coming from, though, because one of the things that you guys touched on, and maybe I want to close with this last question here, is you talked a lot about, and Dr. Sleeth talked a lot about how technology has kind of come in and I would say maybe amplified or sped up maybe some of these things. We become better at being alone, and we're finding out that it's not really that great to be alone. But the church seems to be one of those places that, some might look and say we're walking back hundreds of years when we walk into the church, because we're singing, John Newton, and we're singing all of these old songs we're reminding ourselves of how God has worked in the lives of people in incredibly hard situations. And we can remind ourselves of those stories through these hymns. So John calls us oftentimes to look at Acts 17, where Paul's speaking before the Areopagus, and Paul says something to the effect of God has determined the dwelling places of the people, and he's put them in this time and this place. And so the church is put in a time and a place, and we're oftentimes seen as maybe outmoded. At the same time, I think that there's a reality here that there's a good that we can celebrate. There's a wrong that we can oppose. There's some actions I really feel like the church can take in this cultural moment. And you guys talked a little bit about that for individuals, specifically kind of looking at this idea of ministry of presence, being present with people who are struggling with mental illness or with families that have mental illness going on in their family. But I want to push this idea of the corporate church, going into my church, that there's something also about the corporate movement of the church to deal with this. And if you could kind of give a calling to a body of believers, not just an individual, but a body of believers, what would you say to a body of believers, understanding that this is the way the culture's going, yet as a body of believers, we're also forming culture. We determine that it's normal for us to get together on a Sunday morning and sing songs written by dead people that glorify the Lord, who has made a difference in their life and now in our life. We have made a culture there. So we are culture shapers as a corporate group of people. But is there anything that you would say to a corporate worshiping body or people that are going to church also in this cultural moment, especially with teen sadness, with suicide on the rise, all of those depressing things that you keep reminding us of? What would you say to a body of believers?
It was your idea, Wayne, to take the opportunity of the Mental Health Awareness Month to talk about this. And I know that every month is Awareness Month for something, and half of it's pretty dumb. But I really do believe that we need to be aware, cognizant of the mental health crisis, and educate ourselves as Christians on an individual and a corporate level as to what that means for those within our midst who are going to be dealing with these things. And there are people dealing with these things. Just statistically, there are quite a few, probably in your church, and in my church there are. So recognizing that and knowing how to respond in a wise, godly, carefully moderated way to, I know that it's a cliche to remove the stigma, but there really is a stigma around mental illness that needs to be dismantled, and so that we can respond with wisdom and care and information instead of feelings and fear and reaction. There's nothing that's quite as disturbing to you as watching someone descend into a dark mental place, or a place where they've either lost touch with reality or have come to believe that life is no longer worth living. These are dark states to behold, and to recognize that as a problem that can be addressed through the right ministry and therapy and treatment, I think is key here. We have to be the kind of people who respond intelligently and lovingly. So, and that starts at a corporate level with the church. It's not enough to have a few individuals in the church who are like the go-to people on subject X. We have another person who's depressed. We're going to send them over to Sherry over here, who is the resident expert on mental health stuff. And that's really not enough. The church does not exist to be a mental health hospital. On the other hand, it does exist to be God's instrument in restoring all things. It's the hands and feet of Christ. And so the leadership of the church itself needs to be cognizant of this stuff, recognize, and be ready to respond in a biblical, helpful, and spiritually mature way when these things present themselves. I think that's got to be the biggest thing. The other issue is that we need to see ourselves as the church corporately, and this again starts with the leadership, as the solution to what's wrong with the world, and not just an alternative way of expressing yourself or being in the world. So this goes back to what I talked about earlier with Christianity itself just becoming another way or another mode of expression. It shouldn't be that way. We're telling the true story of the world. We're telling the true story of humankind, and we're giving people the real cure of souls, as I think it was Martin Luther who coined the term. We're giving them the real, medicine for what ails them. And what ails them ultimately is sin, whether that's directly the cause of their suffering or just because that's what caused the world to break. It is sin. And Jesus came to address that and to set the world right. So what we're giving people is not just a means of self-expression, fulfillment, excitement, or even like community or something. It's not this place where, as secular observers often patronizingly say, people come together to create culture and find meaning and so forth. They'll talk about, if you ever watch a documentary on like a primitive culture, they'll talk about how, the shamans believe that this ceremony makes sure that the sun will come up next spring and the days will begin to increase in length or whatever, and that the harvest will come and the rains will arrive and all that stuff. And they have to do this so that all this will happen. I think secularists can look at Christianity in a patronizing way and say, oh, well, that's the story they tell themselves. That's how they create meaning out of a meaningless world. They don't really grapple with the religious claims as if they're claims that an adult could make. They're like claims that they're stories that kids tell themselves in the nursery. But I think it's John Lennox says, it was Richard Dawkins who says that Christianity or religion is a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the dark, and John Lennox shoots back, "Oh, atheism is a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the light." Yeah, it's true. What we're doing here is not just a therapeutic expression. We're recognizing the world the way it really is, and we're giving the world the solution that it needs to the problems that are really at the core of all brokenness and all sorrow and all sickness and all sin. And we should act like that. We should consciously act like that and preach that. So I guess all of that long rambling response is to say we should preach cosmic redemption, and we should tell people what we're really doing here and how big it is. It's not just so we can feel good or even have a close relationship with God. It's so that we can be who we were created to be as human beings, which is worshiping creatures who are in good fellowship with our Creator and each other, and restoring the world according to God's plan in Jesus Christ. Let's go. We're an army, That posture, I think, is really important for leadership to take. And so I guess those are the two main things that come to mind in answer to your question about how the church can corporately address this.
Yeah, that's great. And I think my work here is done. You've ended on a happy note. So that was really good.
You were going to keep going until I did that. We're at 50 minutes now.
I know. I was ready to go another hour and a half. The kids are crazy running in the yard, but we're good. There's always kids running in the yard in my house. So there's always somebody doing something.
And they complain about the heat at my place.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah. And so once summer comes around, they say, "Yeah, it's too hot. I want to come inside and watch the Clone Wars or something." And I say, "Get out there and turn the sprinkler on."
Yeah, my kids don't complain around me anymore, because I tell them if you complain, you have to write 50 things that you're thankful for. So they're all like, "Okay, Dad, I'll sit down at the table. All right, I'm not mad anymore." But
too late.
Yeah, and I don't even read them, so I'm assuming that they're thankful for those things. Well, this is a great conversation, Shane. Thanks for taking some time and diving into this. And I do think that the role of the church in this cultural moment is incredibly important. And so that was a great way to end, I feel like. So thanks for your time, and thanks for going further upstream with us on this topic.
Yeah, thank you, Wayne. And if you're curious about this subject, folks, I can't emphasize enough how much you'll enjoy Matthew Sleeth's book. It's called Hope Always. He walks through all of this stuff in much greater detail and with much greater expertise than Wayne and I ever could.